Hello and welcome back. For this little session, I'm going to go over some highlights from chapters 5 through 7. We're skipping ahead a little bit. The slides that I'm going to show you are very similar to the slides that I posted for chapters 1 to 3 at the very end of that module. So if you want to go ahead and review those sort of with my voice in your head, I'm not going to necessarily record a whole separate section for that. But I just thought I'd touch bases with you guys and give you a little bit of guidance in terms of how these slides can be viewed. They identify some topics, some plot points. I'm going to try and post them pretty regularly. I do have slides for just about every chapter, more or less. So I'm just going to go ahead and walk through this now. Okay, so for now, we have Blood Meridian chapters 5 through 7. Okay, so let's go ahead and move ahead. Okay, so I'm going to start with basically the plot. Oh, sorry about that. I'm going to start with the plot. So far we have met our intrepid travelers. We've been introduced originally to the kid, and we have most of our cast of characters at this point. We will have some more that come along, but for now we're focused mostly on the kid, even though that's a little bit difficult, and the discussion question that I have identifies maybe some of the problems with that in terms of plotting and character development, or lack thereof. But I'll leave that speculation to you guys. But yes, we did start off with a kid, and then a lot of little instances of violence and unpleasantness as they travel around the American Southwest. So we'll pick up here on chapter 5, where Sproul and the kid escape. Sproul, of course, is the person that he met, who's pretty unpleasant himself. And then also Sproul dies. Okay, so this is the end of Sproul at this point. One of the first people that the kid meets that on his journeys throughout the Southwest. The kid is captured by Mexicans, and then he meets Toad Vine, who has a lot of unpleasant characteristics himself. The name itself should probably give you a little bit of a hint about what he's about. Cormac McCarthy doesn't necessarily disguise people too much in terms of their names. Toad Vine probably gives you an interesting image. And from there, when he meets Toad Vine, they are transferred to Chihuahua, from one jail basically to another. Obviously, they're in the Mexican area of the Southwest. And where the judge makes a reappearance. Now, if you recall, the judge made a pretty spectacular appearance in a bar earlier in the book, and he does reappear here, and he sticks around a little bit longer, actually a lot longer. And so we start to get to know the judge quite a bit better, even though that first original introduction in the bar was pretty amazing in some ways and strange. If you recall, he was standing in the back of the bar when somebody was preaching, and he called the preacher a liar, said that he I guess he said he fornicated with animals or something. Just basically making stuff up. We find that out later. Never met him before. He just wanted to start chaos. And the judge does that. Okay, he's a pretty unsightly character, but he is extremely intelligent, as you could probably tell by some of the little monologues that he goes on. Those monologues tend to be really long and confusing, and that is probably intentional. So if you can't follow along with every single word he says, just know that he is sort of this mythical, intelligent, huge figure, and by huge I mean that physically as well. He's very tall, and I may go over some of that a little bit later in terms of how you can visualize the judge. But I will move on with the plot. We have the Jacksons. We meet, and I don't mean the singing group. I mean, of course, Black Jackson and White Jackson, which sets us up a little bit in terms of parables. If you recall, the beginning of, I believe, chapter 7 starts with that idea of Black Jackson and White Jackson were walking along, and it actually looks a whole lot like a parable. And whether that parable pays off for us or not, I'm not sure if I want to reveal that just yet. But I'm reading it off. In the company there rode two men named Jackson, one black, one white. Okay? So that sets us up as like, okay, here's a story in a parable that's going to either pay off or not. And if you've noticed already, these stories don't really go very many places, so I won't necessarily spoil that for you. But I will say that don't count on that making a whole lot of meaning out of the book as a whole. But it is something to note that the language that does get used sometimes is a language of storytelling, and that's something that I will return to as we go deeper into the book. Okay, another thing to note maybe, these notes go into more of the specifics of the language. I'm hoping that I can provide you with a lens to look at some of this language through, because it is a little bit hard to hack through for some people, probably most. So I just thought I'd point out a few things that you can pay attention to along the way. Maybe that will help you understand sort of how you're supposed to take this whole thing all together, so that later on when we revisit overall the book itself, you're not lost, and as along the way, even if the language tends to lead you to areas that you're very confused about, hopefully these little lectures will help focus that. There's a lot of references to language, or landscape, I should say. Language too, but landscape. It seems to be another character. People merge into the grayness. If you recall, there's a scene where they're like riding along and then the dust merges into them, and then the gray landscape is so gray. And Cormac McCarthy does that with language a lot. The gray landscape is so gray that it was gray, and it was really gray. And, you know, there's a lot of different ways of describing sort of this monotonous landscape. That's probably intentional. Actually, not probably. It is intentional. But those references to landscape is just a variety of ways of thinking of the landscape, as what I refer to as the landscape as a character. It's like another character that sort of visits them and influences the plot points and their attitudes and merges into the personalities of the people. Another little thing that I wanted to point out was that dominance seems to be the coin of the realm. And what do I mean by coin of the realm? Well, I guess it's a little bit of a reference to, and I'm going to be a little ham-handed on this because I'm not a history major, but I will say that the way I understand coin of the realm would be like in medieval times, especially in Europe, there were different fiefdoms, meaning that there were kings essentially in different areas that sort of ruled over their vassals. They're like the people that they were in charge of. And so it wasn't like an official country that they would do. It would be like sort of, you know, Sacramento County would have its own king, right? And then next door would be, you know, a couple of miles away, or maybe 20, 30 miles away, there would be like, you know, the King of Davis, and he would have his vassals, and he would build walls around his city, and then the people sort of relied on him to sort of dictate the rules and, you know, punish the people that did wrong. So there was nothing really uniform about moving from one area to the next. It was just sort of like when you moved into that new area, you had to sort of take not a guess, but you had to understand that there were certain rules there that maybe had different meanings, right? So it could be pretty confusing if you're traveling around a lot. Obviously, most of the vassals didn't really move too far. You know, it was just sort of they did their stuff on their land, and they lived their whole lives basically within this little 2-mile area. But for people like this that move around this sort of lawless area overall, each area sort of seems to have its own set of rules and its own guidelines, and that's what I mean by coin of the realm. You figure out what the coin is. You know, each fiefdom may have its own coin, right? Its own monetary system. In other words, its own value system. But dominance seems to be one of the commonalities in all of this. So if you want to look for ways to connect how they're moving from one to the other, I think one of the things about the Glanton gang and the judge is that they're really good about noticing, you know, that dominance is really the rule of law, not necessarily the rule of law. I mean, it's just you dominate the other, and that's once you get that down, everything else sort of follows. So there are legitimate ways of expressing this dominance by the officials sort of in charge, words, treaties, legalities, and they want to write stuff down. They want everything to be official. That seems to be, they want to, certain kinds of people want to legitimize this dominance, but it's pretty much winds up being the same thing, right? It's sort of violence by other means. There's the illicit dominance that happens, and that's sort of the viciousness and the violence. So either A, you have that authority to create sort of legitimate legalities and treaties so that you can dominate other people, right? You write some stuff down and everybody just kind of follows along. That's a way you bully people into things. Or you can just be the most vicious and the most violent, and then you are the most dominant, so therefore you are engaging in that coin of the realm, right? Each one of these types of people tend to engage the other on their terms. What I mean by that is that the legitimate people need the illicit people, right? You can write stuff down and say, this is how it is, I'm just going to dominate you. But then you need these other people to do some violent stuff, right? To make sure that everybody falls in line. The violent people can't just be randomly violent because then they don't actually accumulate anything. They're just sort of, they're kill and be killed kind of thing, doesn't really lead anywhere. So they kind of rely on the people that are legitimate to legitimize their violence so that they can actually dominate people in a more effective way. So that's what I mean by they engage each other with under their own terms. The judge is unique in this sense in that he seems to be able to flip between those two. And what do I mean by that? He can be legitimate when he wants to be and very intelligent and sort of dominate people with his language, or he can be the most violent and the most vicious and the most have the most reputation for that. So he tends to dominate people that way. The question that I will end this particular series of notes with is, do you think this is random, essentially? One of the criticisms of Blood Meridian is that all of this violence tends to get really numbing after a while. So the question is there a battle here going on when all of this violence seems to have no surface purpose other than the violence? Do we understand this to be fate or nihilism? And fate means essentially that everything is fated to happen. So, what happens along the way may not be as important as knowing that in the end, this is all going to lead to X, right? And so in the end, our only battle is basically to figure out what X is, right? So that we can move toward our own fate, right? So if we know the purpose of our life, then all of our actions sort of make sense. If we don't know the purpose of anything, or we don't think that there's a purpose, then all of this randomness in life, in this case violence, but in life, is sort of a nihilism, annihilate, right? Think of that in terms of there's nothing means anything, right? So in this case, because the violence is so apparent and numbing and seems to have no real place in anything we can figure out, right and wrong. That's what we want to do. We want to think about who's right, who's wrong. But in the case of violence that just happens and lots of things that just happen, the world of Blood Meridian seems to revel in that idea that, if you don't have any right or wrong, essentially, that you can rely on, you're reliant upon that idea of, well, everything is fated to happen, or you can just think that nothing has any meaning, in which case, just give up, right? So the people that understand fate in this novel tend to be working towards something, right? And those that are more nihilistic tend to just be like violence for violence's sake. And so the question that I would sort of leave you with at this point would be like, what do you think the difference is there? That might be something that you just hold in the back of your brain for now. And then later on, when we return to some of these in a little bit more detail, and I ask you some questions in the discussion questions, you can explore some of these concepts as well as the ones that I sort of set you up for. Okay, so that's what I got right now, and I'll see, there's real quickly, there's some additional points about narrative and religion that I will introduce in the next one, but that's a little preview.